LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guests today are Pete Wilky and Grov Moluvsky, who join us to discuss their recent book, The Difference We Make. The Difference We Make presents a straight-talking, no-nonsense view of the corruption and abuses of governments and corporations through the lens of popular music culture. Although the tradition of music as a vehicle for protest and resistance has steadily been eroded by the corporate music industry, throughout the decades many grassroots movements have survived and even thrived amidst gathering, tyranny and suppression. The Difference We Make takes a tour of mod, punk, indie and many other music scenes that have spawned outspoken and controversial figures, talking to many well-known writers and musicians along the way. Music has the power to change human consciousness, but can it rise to the critical challenges of our age? Hello and welcome guys, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Nice to be here, Greg.
Hello Pete, you there?
I am here, yes, thank you very much indeed for having us both.
Today we're going to talk about your book, which was published recently, The Difference We Make, and a most interesting book in terms of the balance of contents, the ground that it covers. But before we get into that, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about your personal backgrounds and how you came to do the book in the first place.
Shall I go first?
I think Grov should go first, yeah, because it was initially his idea.
Okay, well, I come from a musical background, Greg. I've been writing songs and in bands since 1980, which is a long time. I was in a band called Asia Fields, and we had some sort of success 89, 90 at the Manchester period. We've kind of thrown in with Charlatans and Happy Mondays and In Spiral Carpets and such like, and we went on to do an album and a few singles, and we had a good time. But I've always wrote songs, but over the last, well, I suppose even back then there was the songs lyrically were looking at problems and solutions, and I suppose you could class them as truth songs in a way where they were a bit solution based, a bit comical as well and ironic. But I've kind of developed that more so over the last 5 years. I'm in a band at the moment called The Homelies, and I'm kind of specifically just doing songs that are regarding these subjects and these topics really that I want to discuss. So I've done them in a song based format. So music, yeah, I definitely come from a music loving capacity. I've been into music since I was very, very small. So, but running alongside that, I've always been interested in research. I guess looking for answers, to questions that were glaringly just very, very apparent, to me that things was not well. I sort of felt this from being a child, and it kind of made me be a little bit odd, I guess, or a bit of a daydreamer, but it was a pursuit that I'm still doing at the moment. So the two of them went together great for me, and I met with Pete only 2 years ago by pure synchronicity. That was just in the same place at the same time, and Pete stands out like a sore thumb really in his regalia and stuff, and I ended up being stood next to him, probably the sharpest looking guy in there, and we just briefly spoke, and then we made a little connection and gave each other details of how to contact each other. And then it was a little while later I saw his stuff on Facebook, and I thought, he's not only into music, and we've not only got classic scooters and stuff like that, but he's a bit of a rebel as well, and looking at his posts and his poetry and stuff, well, they were very similar to mine. So that's quite unusual for just to have like two truthers on scooters. You won't see many of them about. And from there on, I just saw a lot of parallels between us. And at first, I thought I'd really like to do a poetry book, kind of a rebel poetry. And I put the idea to him. I think you'll remember, Pete, the date, but it was.
It was the 2nd of January last year, 2012. And I got a message in Facebook basically off Grov, and as he's just told you, this is how we met. And it basically said about how he wanted to write this book of poetry. And I thought it was a fantastic idea because I love writing poetry myself. But I also thought it was a wonderful opportunity to take the book further and take the book into what it's become. And this is where I'll pass back over to Grov now. But I think I hit Grov with a bit of a mammoth task, because he come to me with the initial idea for the book, and then I just got this crazy snowball effect in my own head of what the book should be and what we could include and where we might go with the book. And then it was back to Grov then for clearance on that, and then the rest is history.
So I'd requested for us to write this book. I'd asked him, and Pete agreed, and he threw in a lot of the music parts of it, which I'd not really thought about, even though I was involved in it. He came up with the idea of elaborating on the mod theme, really, and its rebellion in music and its influence in different genres, etc. I kind of found that idea interesting as well, because the idea of rebellion through creativity is a great one for me. There's not enough of it, and I think it's a great way of fighting back, against the system with something that's creative and unique. So I liked the way it was all falling together. But from there on, the ideas that we had, I've done a lot of projects, Greg, over the years, and you get a lot of closed doors, or you've got to push and push, and this happens and then this doesn't, and you go 2 forward, 1 back. But the doors that opened on this one were amazing, and the synchronicities and the people that just climbed aboard so readily and so easily. And the contacts that they then gave us, it seemed like everybody wanted to get involved in the book, which made it a joy to write and a joy to develop, really.
Well, the book's interesting, as I said earlier, in the balance of contents, because there's a lot in here about different music scenes and different genres over the decades. Then, of course, there's stuff that's social commentary, there's political stuff, and you've not only interviewed a lot of musicians from over the years, you've interviewed a lot of researchers, a bit like yourself, Grov, who are thinking the world isn't quite the way we're led to believe it is. And but basically, the music that you write about over the years, it comes back again and again to the idea of protest music, whether it's very obvious protest music that's very political with very explicit lyrics, or whether it's a bit more subtle than that. And it's really a history of the role that music plays in social and political contexts.
Correct. I mean, I suppose you could take that right back to the indigenous tribes and tribal music, etc. It was always deep and meaningful, even if it was just the resonance and the vibration. But if you had the lyrics as well, it's always been there. So it's obviously a crucial part of evolving, as far as I'm concerned. And obviously, of later years, we've had the likes of Dylan, and he kind of got a lot of it going, didn't he, in the 60s and stuff. But it's a constant battle, really, even through music, because we've reached such a static period now for the last, I'd say, 20 years, where there's been absolutely nothing but R&B and boy bands, and obviously somebody's got control over the whole of the mainstream industry. Well, maybe they did before in some ways, but nothing like now. It's become very, very dank. Dire, I just couldn't even listen to a radio station anymore unless it was, something that I knew wasn't playing anything from the mainstream. It's become awful. Obviously, it's tied up in a corporate way, and obviously they're using symbology and lyrics to their advantage, for certain. If you just look at some of the symbology that Lady Gaga and what's she called,
Miley Cyrus.
Yeah, and in fact, so many of them, and they're on the TV, at 6, 7 o'clock, the guests on the X Factor and all this kind of thing, and it's pure symbology, and I think sexualizing young children and stuff, it's become really awful. So I'm really hoping, it's well overdue, but I'm really hoping that something's going to come along soon and shake everything up in the way that punk did. It really needs it, doesn't it, more than ever at the moment?
I don't know if I can just interject there as well. I think carrying on from what Grov was just saying about music, present day music. There is one great thing happening, and that's young bands. The young bands that are emerging now. The punk scene's re-emerged. The mod scene again is re-emerging. Mod influenced bands are re-emerging. And you know, we employed the uses of a band called the Marquettes for our book launch and for a further book signing date that we did a couple of weeks ago, and they sound absolutely fantastic, and it's really encouraging again to see young bands that are playing serious good music. They're actually stood there playing the guitars and playing the drums and giving it their all, you know, and it is a bit of an antidote to this absolute mainstream nonsense that we've had to endure for the past 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think I've talked to a lot of young bands in the course of my work, and a lot of them cite, these are guys that are just in their early 20s now, if they're even out of their teens, and they cite a band like the Libertines, for example, as kind of coming along and burning brightly for a short time, but really ushering in a new generation of guitar bands. And I think you're both absolutely right. If you look at the mainstream, you turn on the mainstream TV or radio channels, what you're going to get stuffed in your ears, chewing gum, basically the equivalent of. But underground, you look under stones, look down dark alleys, just places where the mainstream won't go. And I think there's a lot of healthy stuff happening. It doesn't mean, of course, that it's all conscious or has some kind of awareness or meaning behind it, but I think it's a lot healthier than, as I say, you would guess just by looking at the mainstream.
But yeah, of course, it's it doesn't need to be socially aware, or it doesn't have to be switched on and awake. I just think the fact that something is being created that's new, it is good in any sense of the word. And there are a lot of young bands now that are picking up and going through it like the old school. Like playing gigs and building up a following, and perhaps it's a different world than it was 20 years ago, but perhaps looking for a single deal and a record deal, kind of harping back to the independent, the indie days of 80s and 90s. And so, yeah, it is inspiring, and they've always been there, of course. It's just, I think you have to look a bit harder these days, because there's hardly anything getting in the mainstream charts. It's very rare, whereas before, good indie bands, they were always popping in and out of the charts, And I say indie just as meaning independent, more not the actual old style of music, but I think it's become less and less really the emergence of good bands in the charts. But I'm hoping that it's going to change.
Well, one look at your book, and it becomes immediately apparent that the aforementioned mod scene, past and present, is a really important part of all this. Now, Pete, just judging by not just the fact you got these scooters, but judging by the fact of your dress, were you part of that original scene? And if so, I'm just wondering about the significance of it, because for someone like me who was never into that scene, most of what I know, quote unquote, about the mod scene comes from watching Quadrophenia multiple times, and in that it's portrayed as kind of just a hedonistic, rebellious youth movement. But perhaps you could just tell us about your experience of it and what you think the wider significance of it was and is.
You're absolutely right. I mean, my first introduction to the mod scene was through Quadrophenia. I am the term I use is a quadro mod. I was 13 years of age. I was playing truant from school one afternoon at a friend's house, where we used to go and watch videos, which had just come out at that time. The new VHS players. I come from a poor background. We couldn't afford a VHS player back in them days, so we had to go to my mate's posh house in the posh part of town, whilst his parents were at work, and we watched two videos one Wednesday afternoon. But the first one was The Warriors, which was the American gang movie.
Oh, Walter Hill, yeah, he's made so many great films.
Absolutely, and it was a bit of a cult movie with those young kids at that time, because it was full of violence, it was full of gang fights, and that's what and we're 13 years of age. Our testosterone had just kicked in, and that's the kind of thing that we was interested in. But anyway, I watched The Warriors, and it was okay, and I wasn't sorry to see the end credits. And then this other film started, which I'd never even heard of, called Quadrophenia, and obviously no one had ever heard that word before. Quadrophenia, the movie, come out, not of our age. Obviously, the older generation that have heard Quadrophenia, the album, which came out in 1973, which is obviously what the soundtrack for the movie is based on. But I watched Quadrophenia for the first time ever, and I had a bit of enlightening moment. When I was very young, I had a serious head injury, and I had a metal bar stuck into my skull, which nearly caused permanent brain damage. But as a result of this head injury, I've had a lifetime of bipolar manic depression. Now, when you're growing up in a tough town like the town that I grew up in, the one thing that you didn't do was start telling your mates that you had some kind of a mental illness, because then you'd be just picked on, bullied, and name called forever. So it was something that I very much kept to myself. And then going back to Quadrophenia, I was sat there watching Quadrophenia this Wednesday afternoon in my mate's house playing through, and that for the first time was the first time I've ever seen someone that's suffering the same kind of mental illness that I was suffering. It was someone that I could relate to immediately, and it was an overwhelming kind of realization that, hold on, it's not just me that has these kind of thoughts and feelings, and it's not just me that has this strained relationship with his parents and with his father, and especially with authority. And I've always had a strange relation, with authority. I talk about it in the book when I was at primary school. Sorry, not primary school, infant school. I was about 8 or 9 years of age, and I've always been a bit of a clever kid. And when I was very young, when I was 7 or 8, I was teaching myself German language from some books that my dad had bought back from his days in the army in Germany. And I taught myself like the days of the week and numbers like 1 to 100 and such likes, and the months of the year, and other such short phrases and what have you. And I was at school one day, and I went to impress. I thought I was a bit of a naughty kid at school, so I thought I'd try and go and impress the teacher and try and score some brownie points. And I went to the teacher and said, sir, I'm learning German, and today's day is Wodenstag, which is Wednesday in German. And without mentioning a word to me, without saying a word to me, he just looked at me and just backhanded me straight in the face, and knocked me completely flat on my backside. And it was that moment, that split moment when I was 8 years of age or whatever it was, that I just looked at authority for exactly what it is, and it's just an abusive system of control in pretty much every single layer and element that it's intertwined into society, which I've only learned since, obviously. But it was that split moment that I was just, as Grov called me before, a bit of a rebel. So going back to Quadrophenia, here I'm seeing this young character here called Jimmy, who's going through his mental illnesses, who's going through his strange relationships with his friends and his parents and his betters, and who's really, really trying, and every time that he tries to fit into a particular clique, a particular circle of people, and with that film, obviously it was about the mod scene, was again something that I could relate to immediately, because it's something that I've always tried to do myself as well. I've always tried to fit in and never quite fitted in. But then, as soon as I'd seen Quadrophenia and me being the psychologically minded person that I am, it all started to fall into place and make a little bit of sense. And so my attitudes and my approach to life was completely different from that day forward. And that's why Quadrophenia, not just for me, will remain a cult movie, because of its impact that it has with young adolescent, predominantly males, but certainly it's affected the lives of a lot of girls as well. It is a massively affecting film. It's a simple script, it's a simple plot, there's not much of a plot to it, but it's a simple, but the underlying messages and the underlying references to youth and growing up and where you fit in the world are all completely included within that movie. And such, as I said, from this day watching it, from the first day that I watched it, I walked out of my friend's house and I was a mod the day after. So I was a 13-year-old mod back in 1980. 1980 was when the first time I saw it. But the mod scene in general, and the reason that we carried on, I have been a mod since watching That movie's been 13. I'm 46 now, by the way, so for 33 years. But the relevance of the mod scene and the reason that I bought into it so much was again to do with its rebellion. The first youth rebellion group, probably in the world, our recent history, was the Beatniks in America. The Beatniks had found this, political, socio-political awareness, and they were speaking out about it, and that's, from the emergence of that, and the emergence of, on the back of then the music, which was Grov was talking about before. You had, the likes of Dylan in the early 60s. It was bringing this subject matter to the fore, but it was all politically motivated and politically charged, and I've always had an interest myself in politics, and I've always had a doubt of politics because I've never been able to grasp the concept of what makes one man better than the next man, what makes one man more important than the next man. I don't recognise the Queen for the very same reason, because she's just an old lady. She's just an old lady in a position. She's no different than my old lady, my mother, except my mother lives in a ward and control flat and doesn't live in Buckingham Palace and 15 other palaces. But what makes this woman different? And I can't get my head around that. And I think that's why I wanted to write the book with Grov, was to challenge all them different ideas, to challenge this thing about assumed authority and how it's become abused and misused now over.
Well, you mentioned Dylan and protest music, and the early days of that. Certainly when we get into the 70s, again, we mentioned Quadrophenia, the Who putting that album out. Then things got, that original Summer of Love, we know what happened there. It just basically died on its feet. Vietnam, all the rest of it, and Altamont, and things took a very dark turn. But the music that had significance and meaning in the 70s was becoming a little bit more subtle. Not always, but sometimes. And you can certainly see a band like The Who, Black Sabbath. A lot of the bands that were big in the 70s really made their careers then, had this underlying, not in all their songs or albums by any means, but this underlying current of commentary, social and political commentary. And people think of the 70s, they quite often think of prog rock, and they maybe think of glam, T-Rex, Bowie, and it's all very hedonistic and escapist. But then you had a band that came to prominence in the 70s, let's say like Pink Floyd, who are wrapped up with the prog scene. But you look at that sequence of albums they did, for example, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, Animals, and The Wall, each one getting more and more stark and blatant, commenting on not just the music business, but on society, politics, the direction the world was headed in. And when punk came along towards the end of the 70s, well, mid-70s really, I suppose, that was seen as diametrically opposed to so-called dinosaur bands like Floyd, like The Who. But in actual fact, they probably had more in common than they realised.
You're absolutely right there, Greg. I mean, them two bands, predominantly Pink Floyd and The Who, throughout the 70s, and let's not make no bones about it, The Who had become a rock band by the 70s. They started off basically as a skiffle band in the late 50s. By the early 60s, they'd been signed, and then Pete Meaden, the first manager, wanted to turn them into a mod band, and they changed the name to the High Numbers and wrote a couple of songs on their behalf. Not giving Pete Townsend his full credit for writing some of the best songs that have ever been written. So they had this mod identity throughout the 60s, but then as soon as they hit the 70s, as soon as they hit 1969, they had fast become a rock band. But then, like you said, the rise then from the psychedelic mod scene, from the emergence of Pink Floyd. I've seen Pink Floyd twice, and they're just an absolutely amazing band live and visually. I mean, the stage shot they give you to visually, it's just absolutely unbelievable. But you're very right about Pink Floyd's lyrics as well. I mean, Roger Waters is what I consider to be one of the best lyricists ever to come from this country, without a shadow of a doubt. He's Britain's Bob Dylan. He's very politically minded. He's very socially minded, and I've enjoyed listening to Pink Floyd since I was probably 14 years of age. And I'll be listening to some more again tonight. But you're absolutely right that it was them bands throughout the early 70s and the mid 70s. But then with the emergence of punk, that's when the world woke up, and that's what, again, another thing that we discuss in a little bit of detail in the book.
The thing I had was, sorry to interrupt you, the thing I had with punk was I didn't care for. I mean, I was a little bit too young to get punk fully. By the time I was getting into music, it was a so-called UK '82 scene. With the Exploited and bands like that. So GBH had moved on a little bit, but was how the punk thing got. And not all the bands fell victim to this by any means, but as typified by Malcolm McLaren, it's how it got co-opted yet again and turned into a product. And the Sex Pistols, they're just the poster boys for that. And I've got respect for John Lydon, no question about it. But I can't, even I see Malcolm McLaren's face, I start to get on edge.
Absolutely. I mean, Malcolm McLaren was your first corporate, for Christ's sake. He was going on about how independent and how single-minded he was. He was single-minded. He was single-minded about himself because he didn't really give a toss about the band anyway. It was him getting rich on the back of them. It was just four very young, naive musicians. But then four young, naive musicians had a very, very important, massively important place in history because they were the first kids that actually stood in front of the TV cameras and says, we've had enough, we've had enough of taking your bullshit. We've had enough of taking your political nonsense. We are going to stand out, and we've had enough of this German Jewish family governing over us. No recall to justice or whatever. They're just free to reign. And we've had enough of that. And it was Sex Pistols when they signed the deal with A&M outside the gates of Buckingham Palace in 1977. And I was born in 67, so I was 10 years of age when I witnessed that. And that massively, massively impressed me. And credit might not go to their musicianship, it might not go to their longevity, but it will certainly go to the impact that they made within the world of music, because from punk, you then got the mod revival period of the late 70s, 1978, 1979, into the early 80s. And it was with that re-emergence then of the mod scene and the punk element, when and the bedroom bands were starting up again, the four lads were getting together and just saying, right, we can do it because the Sex Pistols can do it, or Stiff Little Fingers can do it. But what you've also got to remember as well is that punk was singing about socio-political subject matter all the time. In every one of the songs, they were singing about the struggle, they were singing about the pain, they were singing about the everyday mundanity of things, especially in the late 70s, because it was on a 3-day working week and power cuts every other day. They were struggling. They were living through some crap times. And youth found itself in the late 50s, but by the time the 70s came, by the time punk came in Britain, youth had well and truly put its foot down and says, we're here, and stuck out its middle finger to this society and to the establishment and made its mark, and rightfully so, because youth has never looked back since. Until recently. And it needs now to... It's the youth of today that will be the middle-aged generation of tomorrow and the older generations of later. And those kids are the ones that are responsible for the world that we live in. They're the ones that are responsible for any differences that are going to be made, and they're the ones that are responsible for any changes that are going to be made. And they can only do that if they are all basically tuned in and not singing from the same hymn sheet, but, thinking along the same kind of lines. And we can't get anywhere in this word with bullshit. We need truth.
Yeah, well, we'll get up to date with where we are now, just in a little bit. But you mentioned the end of the 70s there, and so-called winter of discontent, and things were bad. As you say, all sorts of problems with society stemming from problems with industry, which is coming down from problems with government. Yeah. But then we got into the 1980s. And not immediately, of course, but when Thatcher came on the scene, things changed because, well, I say they changed in many ways for the worse. And I often call the 80s the decade of decadence because it all became about superficiality and gloss and what have you. But a lot of those problems that were there at the late 70s, they didn't go away as such. It's just that they were literally glossed over with some of that sheen I mentioned. And it gave the decade a different character. And it by no means a decade that you can write off. There's lots of cliches about the 80s. The whole greed is good, Gordon Gekko, loads of guys with, Slim Jim ties and ponytails taking coke in Canary Wharf. All of those cliches are cliches for a reason. But there was a dark underbelly to the 80s too. And that was also reflected in some of the music that came along, because you had ska, for example, reflected a lot of that. You think of the Specials and Ghost Town. You had the post-punk and the new wave bands, Joy Division, for example, and a lot of them were bringing, if not intellectual, they were bringing a more philosophical, thoughtful aspect to their music and lyrics. And even, as I say, if it was mainly symbolic and subliminal and subtle, there was something there that didn't just cave into the overall tone of the 80s, which I say was one of just, party like it's 1999.
You're absolutely right about the ska thing, and one thing you've got to include in that is the two-tone movement, and the two-tone movement was ultimately responsible for the unification of black and whites in this country, because blacks and whites had always lived in separate communities and distanced themselves from each other, and it was that that musical unification, especially with two-tone, and especially with bands like UB40, who were massive at the time. Bringing that black and white youth together, and thankfully it stayed together, and it still does. And the scooter scene, the mod scene, and the continuation of that scene in this country. The mod scene is the only scene in this country, the only subculture in this country that's lasted for 50 years. I know the rockers might contend that and say, we're just as prominent now as we was back then, but they're not. The mod scene has always been a little bit. I'm fishing for an adjective which I'm not gonna find, but it's always been a prominent scene. It's always been a popular scene. Again, like I said, it's just enjoying a re-emergence now. But it wouldn't have got anywhere without that late 70s punk time, that late 70s, early 80s two-tone mod revival, call it what you will, time. That was massively important for this whole country in the unification, like I say, of blacks and whites.
One other thing that we saw, which I thought was very significant in the early 1980s, was the demise of the free festivals. And these things had been around since the 60s, I guess, and lasted throughout the 70s. And those were a real thorn in the authorities' side, not so much because of any trivial law breaking that might have gone on, people smoking pot in a field for a weekend or whatever, but it was because it represented, again, not in all cases, but it represented a radical alternative to the ways that we were all being told that, life was good. The whole semi-detached house, wash the car on Sunday, mow the lawn, take the kids to school, get a good job, keep your head down, pay your taxes and be a good boy. And what the free festivals represented was a viable, might not be for everybody, but a viable alternative to that. And that, as I see it, that couldn't be allowed to continue.
Apart from the fact there was no profit involved, and I think that's what the government couldn't get their head around, is because it was a non-profit making thing.
Yeah, exactly. But the way that the brutality with which they were shut down, for people who don't know, or even people who remember the Battle of the Beanfield, and I think that was 1984, Stonehenge, and other free festivals that were based in London and the home counties, the brutality with which that was suppressed, and that also applied to not just people who would roll up and organise and attend these festivals, but people who actually lived somewhat of a nomadic life without a lot of the, things that we take for granted in more mainstream society. That spoke to something a little bit more than there's no profit in this. Because even where there is profit in something, you look at, for example, at Glastonbury, that's now just a big corporate business. But that started out as not maybe in the spirit of the free festivals as such, but it was radically different to what it is now.
Well, I think the band that we need to immediately mention is the Levellers, because the Levellers and Mark Chadwick, the lyricist, Mark Chadwick is probably one of the best protest lyricists, again, that this country's ever produced. He's certainly on a par with Roger Waters, but on in two different genres of music. And the Battle of the Beanfield, as you spoke about just a minute ago, very, very necessary to have these kinds of these socially aware musicians and lyricists and artists, and that to get the message out there to their broader, to their broader audience. And I think it's something that we need to promote more and more and more these days. This book that Wilky and Grov have done, it's an independent publication. This is me and him doing it. We've not got some big multi-million-pound publishing house behind us backing us and promoting the book and doing everything on our behalf. We're doing it, including from writing the book to posting the book, or even in some cases me personally delivering it on my scooter. You don't get that on Amazon.
I certainly don't.
I like the point you made, Greg, before. Sorry for jumping in there, but the point that you that you made about the ferocity of which the free festivals were stopped. You must always look at that. That's a huge problem for the government when they move in them kind of ways. I say the government, but they were behind it as you go up the pyramid. When you look at the way they deal with things, they wanted that stamping out for a reason. And I think another one of the reasons is they don't like that. Well, this is probably going off an adjacent thing here, but they don't like that vibrational construct of people getting together because it gives off an energy, and it's not the energy that they want. They're in control of energy constructs, and they keep everything down, they keep everything fear based, and I don't think they like the idea of a collective energy of positive vibes, and you could maybe even throw in the vibe of the vibration of love there, at some of those festivals and stuff, but certainly a lot of people coming together and raising a vibrational energy. I think you must always look at the way government and the police handle things. It's the same as, you can go and rape somebody, or you'll get a gentle tap on your door, and you might go to court a bit later on. But if you grow 3 or 4 of God's plants in your attic, you'll get 4 riot vans, 18 police with riot shields and helmets on, bashing your door down. So it was an interesting point that you raised, that the ferocity of how they did that. There's always a reason behind it.
Can I just add as well that you're right there, Grov, because the 1980s rave scene was a prime example of that. Where people were loved up. I know that because I was part of it, and it was an amazing atmosphere. It was drug induced, but it was an amazing atmosphere and an amazing interaction between humans. And it's something that you will never see under normal, everyday circumstances, and lawful circumstances, albeit. But yeah, the rave scene was very much part of that as well.
Well, it's an interesting point here for me personally, because when I first started going to what we could understand as truth conferences, whether they were talking about 9/11 or talking about banking cartel or talking about UFOs, whatever it happened to be, it was people coming together to get into some very interesting topics, listen to people doing presentations on their special area. And after initially going to a few of those, I reached a point where I thought, this is a talking shop. It's interesting, but it's always the same faces, But someone pointed out to me later, and I had to agree with them, that actually maybe some of those events are like that, but do you know what? It does generate an energy, and sometimes it can be well worth spending whatever it is, 50 quid, $75, to have your attendance for 2 days somewhere, to just immerse yourself in that energy that you just don't get if you're sitting at home alone looking at the internet.
It's absolutely correct that you don't get that. You don't get that energy. You don't get that energy if you go into a pub. If you go into a public place, it's something to do with people being aware, and they must be resonating at a different kind of frequency for some reason. Perhaps they are in tune with things more, and perhaps they have got more of empathy for fellow man, etc. And you do, if you're in an event like that, it can leave you. It can leave you quite dizzy sometimes, and there is a heightened energy there for certain. You couldn't deny that. If you walk into it, you can feel it immediately, and obviously that kind of thing would be a definite problem, because that's the way to change things, really. I think personally, this is only my opinion, but I think the way to change things, and everything's important. Whether you're studying Pythagoras, and his influence on Stonehenge, or Fibonacci codes, Vedic proofs of reality, the Tetrad. There's loads of different things. Nag Hammadi, the Madrid bloody Codex. You can go into all of those things, but for me now, I just feel that the way things are going to change is to change an inner vibration on some level. And of course, people have been saying that for thousands of years. It's not my doing. It's just the way I see things changing now is definitely on a personal level, to raise your own vibrations, your own awareness.
Because it does seem clear that protest doesn't work. Because you had a 1 million person march against the Iraq war, but it was always going to go ahead anyway. And this is not a counsel for apathy or despair, far from it. It's just that there are certain ways that we get channeled into venting our frustrations that are designed very much to dissipate them and control them, and they don't work.
They don't work. They'll never work. Sometimes it's good. Sometimes it's good to know other people are on your side, and to have a measure of you know, where the sort of truth movement maybe is, or where the awakening, where that is. Yeah, it's nice to see there's a million protesters in Madrid. Sometimes it can make you feel okay, but it isn't the answer. Definitely, you know, I think the answer is, well, it's that choice again. You know, a lot of people have said it, but you either go down the fear route or you go down the love route. There's only two emotions for me, and everything else is a derivative of those. And I think, you know, if you can stand in your own sovereignty, good in your heart, you know, intending to do nice things for people, and, you know, have good intention. I think if everybody did that to a degree, a lot of things would change. It's definitely on an inner level. You know, you definitely have to change yourself. You know, you start with yourself, shall we say? I think that's become apparent to me after 25 years of research.
You know, they do say you can't change the world, but you can change the world in you.
Exactly, yeah. And I just wish I wouldn't have wasted 25 years. And I'd have got that straight away. It's all interesting, you know.
What we've also got to consider as well is, though, that there's a lot of social expectations and a lot of social, you know, restrictions that we've got with ourselves. You know, we're not as open as a society as we to be, beyond the internet, obviously. I mean, but socially on the streets, you know, I used to work in the pub trade for 20 years, and I'm strongly of the belief that this blanket smoking ban that the government brought in to basically shut down 3/4 of the pubs that this country ever had. Was one of the ways of basically, you know, breaking up one of our last meeting places. It was the pub game. When I got into it, that's where I learned a lot of my politics and a lot of my social politics was in the tap rooms of pubs, full of smoke and full of 60, 70, 80-year-old blokes putting the world to rights. And the governments don't like these congregational meeting places where society and communities will put their world to rights. I mean, look, they've shut down all our pubs, they've shut down community centres, they don't fund community centres, they don't want communities and society getting together to share ideas. So thankfully we've got the internet.
Well, you read my mind, Pete, because Grov had mentioned pubs, and I was going to come on to this demise of pub culture, and I'm in complete agreement with you. You don't have to get too conspiratorial about it, but clearly there's, you know, alcohol consumption's never been higher, so it's not like people don't want to have a drink anymore.
No.
Obviously there's a downside to that as well, but yeah, it's now, the pubs used to be a place, obviously some pubs are just jukeboxes and, you know, people yelling at the top of their voices, or maybe just trying to, it's a meat market, they're just trying to pick someone up. But a lot of the real good pub was somewhere where you're right, you'd set the world to rights, and if you were a younger guy, you know, you could learn. You know, certainly when I first went into pubs, way before I was old enough to drink, but I'd go in sometimes with my granddad, and it was these older guys that had the worldly wisdom, and it was fascinating to listen to them speak. But now it's the blue glow in everyone's front room as people sit around the television, you know, and you know, that's their evening. You know, they get their beer from Tesco and then they sit in front of the goggle box.
And this is the beauty of the internet, and this is the beauty of Facebook and meeting people like me meeting Grov. You know, we live 8 miles apart from each other. Without Facebook and without that similarity of circles, we would never have met. But I wasn't being overly conspiratorial when I said about it. You know, it's one of the government ways of shutting down these community social meeting places. But the problem with the pub game now, and the reason that it's become it's just ultimately corporate. There's very, very few private landlords still running their boozers that their mums and dads and grandfathers and, you know, great-grandfathers had run. Pubs now are owned by holding companies that own 250 pubs. And I don't want this to sound, you know, slanderous in any way, shape or form, but Wetherspoons certainly didn't do the pub trade any favours, because they just went in there, undercut every single pub in town, basically made them struggle to compete. And then 12 months after Wetherspoons had basically blanketed the country with their cheap pubs, the government brought in this smoking ban, which was basically just the final nail in the coffin for the locals, you know, the local boozer that was dependent on the 60, 70, 80-year-old afternoon drinkers.
Well, this is a sort of like what Starbucks do, isn't it? It is a corporatization of everything. Starbucks come in,
and it's youth-driven or youth-orientated, you know. Yeah.
They open more coffee shops than are sustainable, but they know they can afford to make a bit of a loss. some of the local places close down, and then Starbucks close half theirs, and there they are. I'm not trying to single them out. There's lots of businesses operate that way, but
other companies are responsible and are operating, of course. But as soon as the corporates become involved, everything becomes dilute. It becomes like a single layer of film on a table. It's flat. It's boring. There's no dimension to it. It's just all it's driven by is profit, and there's got to be something more to spending the only few hours you've got of your social life sat in somewhere than just being extortionately charged nearly £4 for a pint of lager.
What related to the pub closures is music venues closing down, and a lot of these music venues were also pubs, just pubs that had a tradition of putting on bands. And we see the same corporatization taking place in venues now. For example, there's a string of venues operated by O2, the mobile phone company, or not operated by them, sorry, it's just branded O2. And these are quite relatively diverse venues in terms of their history, in terms of their architecture and how they used to operate. But now that they're under the O2 banner, the object, a bit like McDonald's and Starbucks, is to make them as similar as possible so that you know what you're going to get when you go to an O2 venue, whether it's a £4 pint of Carling, whatever it happens to be. Oh, I suppose that'll be the Carling venues, but they sponsor them as well. But, it's to sanitize things. Now, there are certain improvements that come with this. Maybe some people don't miss the days of the sticky carpets in clubs and the toilets that you can smell before you see them, etc., etc. But it does come at a cost.
They're doing this, aren't they? They're doing. Well, it's a very, very deliberate ploy that they're using here. They're also doing it with architecture. You can go in any country now in Europe, and you'd struggle a lot of the times to know where you were. They're kind of taking the identity out of most things and making this bland kind of similar architecture, but also you've just said it, with venues and with places that people drink coffee and places that people meet. They're taking the creativity out of almost everything. And the sad thing is, some 15, even 20-year-olds now wouldn't really know any different. We've been blessed a little bit because we're probably the last of the people to enjoy those creative venues, creative architecture, creative cities. I feel quite lucky, but it'll be a distant memory if something doesn't come along soon and change it. But I believe it will come along. I think it's destined to, but it's a deliberate thing that they're doing for certain. So like you say, sanitizing is a good word.
They're sanitizing and they're trying to make everything uniform. And there's one thing that humanity is not, and humanity is not uniform. There's 6 billion of us on this planet, and there's 6 billion different individual, independently thinking brains on this planet. We cannot be uniformly expected to perform and exist.
Well, it's kind of a forcement, isn't it?
Well, this is exactly what they're trying to do, or it's what I believe they're trying to do. Look at the industrialization of schools. In my town alone, we used to have 4 or 5 very, very commendable primary and infant schools. Every single one of them got knocked down, and they moved it into this big warehouse-shaped building, nowhere near the centre of town. And now all these parents, have got to take their kids to school in the morning. I've got to travel from the furthest outreaches of town to go to this big education mill, and I dread to think what the curriculum's like in there. So this unification, or this uniformation, should I say, it extends to every level and every age group.
Yeah, and you're right. What goes on in there isn't good either. It's all left brain logic. It's all it's further stunting people's creativity. There's very little right brained activities, very little drama, music. It's really they're just conditioning them, aren't they, for a lifetime of
school will
work.
Teach you. Any school will teach you 3 things. It will teach you to read, to write, and to count. And that is all it will ever teach you, because you will never remember what they taught you in history, apart from the stuff that's repeated to you, that's drilled into you. You're never going to remember much from geography. You're never going to remember much from metalwork unless you become an engineer or something. So you're going to remember to read, write, and you're going to remember to count. That's it.
I call them expectation management facilities, because it's very much about giving you a view of the world, and this is what you will expect when you leave. So the sort of things you'll expect to do, the sort of things you can expect to hope for or to be, are all quite narrowly channeled. And that's really what school's about. And there was a time when people speaking like this would be dismissed immediately as conspiracy theorists, but there's so much work being done on it now, right back to what they talk about as the Prussian model for schooling, and it's documented. I recommend people check out the work of American guy called John Taylor Gatto, and he will set out for you in great detail and at great length the true purpose behind the formal compulsory education system.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely by design. There are some forces at play that are planning and plotting this demise of our creativity and our expectation of what we can. I mean, and it's very difficult. I mean, I've got quite a few children, and there's a big age group between them. But I have an 11-year-old, and between him and his brother, who's 20, there's a whole. It's changed dramatically at school. It really has changed unbelievably. So I've seen it changing just through my own children, and I'll not be keeping him in this education system more than another few months. I'm making plans to pull him out. It's that bad because it's his life. By the time he gets to 18, obviously they've extended the amount of time that the brain conditioning goes on now to 18. It is a finished article almost. So it's very important for me as a parent to concentrate on that fully. He just pops his head around the door laughing here because he knows he's getting out of school. But it's incredible to not promote somebody's kind of ability to create things. And I mean, we're capable of such marvelous things, absolutely incredible, and it's tragic. It's tragic what they've done to our children, and it upsets me greatly, and I'm concerned for obviously what's to come as they become adults, etc. Because the damage is done in a lot of ways, and I'm just hoping that something comes along to correct it.
You look at some highly successful people, Steve Jobs, Richard Branson. There's a string of others I could list, and I'm not condoning or otherwise what they've done with their lives and their businesses. But there's a load of people like that you can cite that dropped out of school early or never had any formal schooling. So the idea that having these qualifications, so-called these bits of paper, which really only proves that you've managed to memorize something just long enough to get through the exam, the idea that somehow prepares you for how the world really is, or on the other hand, fosters and brings out your innate creativity is just false.
A lot of people can't even. There's no practical skills that they're shown anymore. Just survival skills, forging, or even sewing a button on a shirt. Just all of those basic skills that my parents had, where they could survive. They could create things. They could mend things. They could fix things. They could grow things in the garden. All of these have been eliminated from school curriculum. And again, it is easy to be like. Just to accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist, but it's just not so. That they actually have been eliminated, and people are not afforded these skills anymore. And there's a reason behind that. We just become so dependent upon whatever it is we need, that somebody above us will give it to us. It's all by design.
We mentioned left brain thinking, and before I forget, one little thing I want to interject with. Thomas Sheridan, who's a chap I've interviewed several times. I know he's a contributor to your book as well. We'll come on to the other contributors in a moment. But we've discussed the idea, we talked about music a lot today, the politicians and the controllers and these elites that we're talking about, all these technocrats that seek to make everything uniform, control our lives. We look at their music taste. And Thomas and I talked about this much to our mutual amusement. And a lot of these people, through their music taste, which can be, just doesn't make any sense. I'm all for like eclecticism, but it just doesn't make any sense. These people, a lot of them are actually, if not psychopaths, borderline psychopaths. And when you look at other areas of life that we consider normal, like your music taste, it's just something organic that you grew up with and it develops over the course of your life. Like, for example, they had, was it David Cameron, who's the current Prime Minister, head of the Conservative Party here in the UK. I'm saying this for the benefit of overseas listeners. Yep. And he was on Desert Island Discs. So if you don't know what that is, folks, you can look it up. and one of the records he chose was Benny Hill's, I can't remember the full title, but it's something like Ernie, the Fastest Milkman in the West. And this is
that's the title.
A stupid novelty song on a par with a Birdie song. And I remember I was in the bathroom at the time. I was having a bath, and I remember stopped and looked at the radio, and I thought, this guy can't be serious. Not just because the song's bad, but if he's actually put that forward as one of his choices, that tells us something. I'm not even sure what it is, but...
That tells me that I can quite clearly now picture David Cameron doing the Birdie and the Tweety song and waving his arms up and down, because he's just cut out to be that kind of bloke. And as for having serious music taste, I think he quoted last week at Prime Minister's Question Times the London Nil Hull 4 album by the House Martins, and Paul Heaton then went onto Twitter and basically reminded David Cameron that he's banned from his pub for life, and so is George Osborne, and went into a very, very anti-Tory tirade.
Well, you mentioned Paul Heaton, and I said I said we'd get on to some of your contributors. So your book, just to remind listeners once again, it's called The Difference We Make. And it's not just writings by you guys, but Thomas Sheridan, who I mentioned, he's in there, Paul Heaton. You talk to a lot of musicians and a lot of researchers, and they've all contributed little bits that form the second half of the book, haven't they?
So we tried to connect a theme of, well, it was difficult really, as Pete will back me up. It was very difficult to tie together truthism with modism and with Manchester and with punk. But the theme that we've tried to underlay throughout the book is rebellion. What makes people rebel? What makes people look at society and think that's that's absolutely flawed? So we tried to tease certain questions out of the contributors, and they were great. It was through them really that the book kind of found some uniformity, and we was able to tie all these themes together. I mean, We've got interviews from Santos Bonacci to a gangster in London, and they're quite similar, although they're very different, and they're coming at it from very different things. But they're both unhappy with the system that's being forced upon them, and the rebellion. However they choose to rebel is the interesting thing of the book for me. One's studying national shamanism, and one's a gangster in London. But I think what that is, though, Grov, is that we've all got a social awareness. You know what I mean? Regardless of wherever you are in society, everyone's got a social awareness, and from the gangsters to the journalists, from the the punk bassist to the lead singer of the House Martins or whatever, or the keyboard player of the Spiral Carpets, everyone's got this social awareness, and and that was I think that was the attraction for the book, and why we did attract so many contributors. Because we're not just talking about a particular, a music scene. We're not just talking about music in general, because music books have been written forevermore. But it was to do with that social awareness and that social political awareness.
And I think that reminds us that the breadth of contributors that you have, and also the age range. Guys going back, considerably older than we are, who've really been around the block a few times. It reminds us, from my perspective anyway, that it's not us that's abnormal. We're not the weird ones. And when you get to talk to people, on some level, even people who get their information from the mainstream, on some level, they can agree. Because they don't want war. They don't want environmental destruction. They don't want social strife. What most people want is to live their lives with their family and friends in peace.
Exactly. I mean, you could have I've said those exact words myself. If you can ask any member of the public, and if you asked them what was important to them, it'd be a little holiday now and again, a little bit of travel, to be at peace with the family, exactly as you've just said, to love the family. They're not great expectations, and even those are being kind of taken away from them. So there is a similarity between us all, and in what we desire and what we require to make us happy. And as you said, we're not the misfits. We're not the weirdos. If you want to see a bunch of weirdos, you just have to look at watch on TV the Houses of Parliament debates. And if you can't get it from that, then I don't know. You need to do some soul searching, or if you just watch the news, or if you just watch X Factor, it's blatantly obvious to me where the freak show lies. if you look into the eyes of a lot of these people, there's a lot of clues there too, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, albeit we are doing what we do, we're by far the misfits of the society, and I like that what you said.
Well, that point you just made about the eyes is very significant, and I've said this time and time again, and it's where, when I first began to realise as a young child, looking at, mainly it was people on television, and initially I thought that their eyes looked strange because they were on television. I thought perhaps I met them in person it would be different. Then later in life, when I met people who were politicians, and again, this does seem to be a bit of a mantra with me, but I'm not including everyone in this category, but I'd meet people, politicians or other people in positions of power, and there's something about their eyes, whether it's from Tony Blair to George Bush, the idiot boy Bush, through to the Queen. I mean, am I the only person? Clearly I'm not, but I sometimes ask myself, am I the only person who finds Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen of England, chilling?
Frightening to look at. And I've got a picture of her with the Pope, and the two of them together are worse than any horror movie I've ever seen. And yeah, that's the challenge, just if you just ask people to look into the eyes, that there is, well, I suppose you are looking into the eyes of a sociopath and a psychopath, and they have very different eyes than somebody that emanates love and kindness. They are very different, and it's a good test. It doesn't all, I can't say on every account that it's going to be right. Some people might just, fall into that category by
I suppose if you was
error,
I suppose if you was a conspiracy theorist, though, you might suggest that these people, the establishment and the elite, are taking some kind of a potion. Why they always seem to live to past 100? Are they taking some kind of an elixir?
Well, I think we can live to past 100, can't we? Naturally, but we're the ones that are conditioned into programming ourselves to live to 70 years
half
and
of the
more,
Half of the royal, they should be dead already.
But they're not eating food, are they, with MSG and aspartame in? They're not drinking fluoridated water. They're not kind of having to deal with all the stuff that is being forced upon us. So I don't know whether they are taking an elixir of life, but just the absence of what we have to endure would
maybe eating swan.
Yeah, well, if you've got, to be honest, whether they avail themselves of it or not, because we can think of people in elite positions who have substance abuse problems, or something like Robert Maxwell, for example, if you remember him, who was massively overweight and very unhealthy. But some of them clearly have access to the best of everything, best being in quotes. But, if you've got healthcare, all you need, the absolute best people, the cleanest food, the cleanest water, constantly comfortable environment, never having any physical stresses and strains, that's got to make a difference. Because we can see people, if I can put it, on the outside, who live amongst us, who live really well, and sometimes they can reap the rewards,
Oh, definitely, I can only imagine Robert Maxwell sorted himself out now, since he fell off that boat and
mysteriously disappeared onto the island with all the rest of them.
But he was a key figure, wasn't he, Maxwell, and with Thatcher, I think and Eddie Shah, I don't know if you remember him, but they had definitely they broke the print unions, and after the mining unions, they were very, very prolific in that period. But no, it's true. They just don't have to suffer the things that we suffer, and also we suffer conditioning. You see, the higher up you go, these politicians and such, they have a lot of knowledge. There's no doubt it's misused, but they have a lot of knowledge, and they're not subject to the conditioning that we are. They probably know that the human cells don't have to die off at 70 and 80, that they can go well beyond 100 years. But because of our conditioning, we tell ourselves that, we're good for 70 years, and, if we get there, then that's probably it. We're totally conditioning our bodies, virtually to their own death. I believe, personally, I think belief systems and thought forms are very real, and I do think they can change things, on an atomic level, and certainly cells can respond to information. If you're a worrier, your cells can form an ulcer, it can form cancer. So all these things are kind of important. And yeah, Pete, you're right. Not many of them go at 70 and 80.
What you just said about physical health is really true, because beyond trauma, which is, for example, having your arm or leg cut off, there's not much you can do about that. It's kind of gone. Or toxicity, which is poisoning, maybe radioactive poisoning or drinking arsenic or something. Beyond that, the most important thing that affects your reality, and the part of that being your physical condition, is what you believe, what you think.
Absolutely. It's 90, for me personally, it's 95% of it, because I know that the cell responds to thought forms and belief systems, like I said before, and I know the cell can be regenerating itself and renewing itself up to 120 years. It could go even beyond that. It's that powerful, and the thought form and the belief system is massive, and it will override many of the things that we have to endure. But we need to look at that and understand that, and start living that and changing our belief systems a little bit more.
Well, guys, listen, we've been talking today about your book, The Difference We Make, and a lot of things related to it, and there's so much food for thought in there that we could go on all day. But perhaps as we wind things up for this session, you could share with listeners information about the book, where they can get it. I know you've got a website specially for the book, and I don't know if you've got any more promotional events, but you certainly did quite a sequence of events to promote the book, and signings and what have you. So just anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I'll just say the book's available, like you say, from our own website. There's some good, interesting stuff on there as well, and the website's growing at the moment, and that's thedifferencewemake.co.uk. It's also available on eBay at the moment, and there are a few independent stockists, but they're just in the odd cities, really. So I think the best way to purchase the book, and probably the cheapest way, would it be, Pete, is thedifferencewemake.co.uk. That's the official the address for the official website is
www.thedifferencewemake.co.uk. It is available on eBay. Just type in The Difference We Make. And we do, as Grov's just said, we do have a couple of stockists of friends that have their own businesses. We have one in Brighton on Madeira Drive at the Modern World Gallery, owned by our friend Neil Sykes, and at the Skin Graffiti Tattoo Studio in Bury, Lancashire, which is owned by my good friend Jimmy. Because this is a self-published book, we are, of course, looking for further outlets. So if there's anybody listening that can, offer any advice, or may want to stock this book on our behalf, then we'll be certainly happy to talk to you.
Excellent. Well, Grov, Pete, thanks guys so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programmes offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.